We've been talking a lot about paid and the relationship between paid, owned, and earned over the past couple days. Chris and team are going to demystify all of that for you in the next 45. So let's give them our undivided attention.
That's my clock up there. Keep an eye on things?
Yes.
Okay. We'll try to make sure there's plenty of time at the end for questions because hopefully, given the meaty and controversial topics contained here, there's going to be a lot to talk about. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having us and spending some time with us. Quick, in terms of intros, my name is Chris Paul. I joined Edelman about 7 months ago to lead paid media globally and kind of organize the numerous sort of upstart and organically developed paid media practices around the world. I came over from came over from Publicis. I'd been with various Publicis agencies for the past 10 years, a couple tech startups before that, and feel very fortunate to be joining Edelman, as particularly at this stage, as we ramp up what we're doing in content marketing and the role that paid plays, and that's what we're going to be talking about here today. So immediately to my left is Eddie Kim. Eddie is founder and CEO of SimpleReach, which is the industry standard for content performance measurement and distribution. We're going to give all of our panelists a chance to talk about exactly what they do in the clearest and simplest terms possible. Eddie's a serial entrepreneur, starting in Shanghai in mobile e-learning and the directory spaces, launched SimpleReach in 2010, and is working with many of the world's largest publishers right now, including New York Times, Forbes, Huffington Post. And interestingly enough, Eddie is also schooled in the liberal arts, BA in music. I was a philosophy major myself. Like to mix it up a bit here and bring in some real nerdy folks. To his left is John Tauber, who is the head of brand and publishers for Central US for Outbrain. Prior to that, John spent some time at AOL, Miller Coors, and Leo Burnett, so has really seen the industry from all sides. True disruptor in ad tech, now the leading content discovery platform on the web, working with both publishers and advertisers and agencies to provide interesting, relevant content and really take full advantage of the web as a mix of interesting and leading content. Finally, Nate Goslin, head of strategy for Sharethrough, also has some history on the agency side with Goodby Silverstein and also worked at D-Side Records in DC, another music fan and industry vet. Sharethrough is the world's largest in-feed advertising exchange. So we're also going to give Nate a chance to explain what that means. But really what they do is they enable native distribution of all forms of content, including video, editorial, and social. Really want to hammer the point home that when we talk about content distribution, we're not necessarily talking about text on a page. It can take a number of different formats, and all the folks here are fairly familiar with multiple forms of distribution. So, kicking it off, I wanted to start with John and ask him a question to sort of set the stage. Why are technologies like Outbrain scaling so quickly over the past 1 to 2 years? Why are we talking about this now as opposed to a few years ago? What is it about the communications landscape that has made the offering attractive to brands and publishers?
Yeah, I mean, I think timing is a huge part of it. So, I think a lot of it is, having the right business model at the right time. And I think what we're seeing in the digital space is, a move from generalization to specialization. And Outbrain's founder had a very clear vision, which is, helping people discover interesting content online. So really what the Outbrain platform is attempting to do is take that same experience someone has when they read a magazine, where they're flipping from page to page. And not every article or video, I should say, on TV it'd be a video, but on a magazine, every article is the same. They're different, but ultimately they're interesting. So really part of the reason we've been able to grow is we've taken on almost about $100 million in funding, specifically to develop interest-based algorithms to grow our distribution. We currently reach about 83% of the US population every month. And then also importantly, really to grow that globally. So it's find something that works, have a clear vision, have a repeatable model that's timed right, and then just scale.
What is it, I mean, to continue, what is it about now? What is it about the communications landscape now that says we need an Outbrain?
Yeah, we've been fortunate in that we really have two distinct buckets of buyers from Outbrain. So actually, quick show of hands, how many people here are familiar with Outbrain? Okay. So the really quick explanation is when you're reading an article and you get to the bottom and you see those recommendations to content, and it'll say it's usually, more recommended from the site you're on, like CNN or ESPN, and then next to it'll say from around the web. So that's actually Outbrain. And so our branding is actually fairly recessive. Part of why I think the timing is right is because we very seamlessly blend into a publisher's environment. And then actually other publishers buy traffic from us on a cost per click basis. So you actually have like the New York Times, for example, Time Inc., buying traffic from us because they've actually realized that they are more profitable based on the people who they get to sign up for their paid services or the advertising they're selling than they necessarily pay us on a cost per click basis. So that's really the value proposition for publishers. So I think it's an instant opportunity for the publishers who've installed us on their site to monetize Outbrain, and then for other publishers who buy traffic from us to make money off that. The other bucket of buyers we have now are brands. So I think as brands start to behave more like publishers, a trend I'm sure you all see, and also as brands start to behave more like journalists, so not just amplifying their own content, but curating content that can help present them as a thought leader, or curating content that speaks about them. They've become that other bucket. So I think, kind of back to your question on timing, I think the fact that we have something that works well and we have two distinct audiences who buy from us has really, really allowed us to scale.
Okay. So throwing it over to Nate, a slightly different approach for Sharethrough. I think looking, kind of solving for the same issue, which is content discovery, but also having that element of kind of depending upon and expecting the user to propagate things that are interesting to them, the consumer, for things to propagate and really create a trusted recommendation. This is worth reading. This is worth spending some time with. Go ahead and talk about how you approach that.
About how we try to surface relevant content to users? Is that what you're getting at? Or
surface relevant and then inspire people to share.
So, sharing something's interesting. I think everyone right now working from the social end of things is looking at sharing at the holy grail. At Sharethrough, we're really looking at just, there's something, and I think Eddie can speak to this as well, there's something beyond like that click engagement that's really important. Like Sharethrough, for those of you who aren't familiar with us, we look at this in-feed content space as something that's evolved from really the use of mobile phones and the rise of mobile. I think we'll get to that a little bit later as well. But if you look at your phone and start just going to really any publisher or any social app or anything like that, you'll notice that you're quickly in a feed environment, meaning you're swiping through just headlines, thumbnails, all of that. And as that's really risen, I think you've seen all the publishers starting to switch to a feed-based model. We actually just saw a stat recently that 21 of the top 21 Nielsen-ranked news sites are all using a feed, both in their mobile and in their desktop environment. So what Sharethrough has done is built this in-feed placement, meaning you scroll down and you see 3 to 4 placements through the feed, you'll see a sponsored piece of content. And what we think is really unique about that, similar to what John was speaking to, is that there's this moment in time now where publishers are seeing that there's this whole new world that they need to start monetizing. And banners aren't necessarily working with that. I think anyone who's ever seen a banner ad on a mobile phone is generally going to be annoyed, especially once you click on it and realize that you didn't want to do that. There was actually recently, if you saw, I think, Google with some of their AdSense things, when you would click on a Google AdSense banner, it would actually ask you again, are you sure you actually wanted to click on that? Because I'm pretty sure that's not what you wanted. But so we've done that, and what it's become is now a way for publishers to monetize with quality content. And for a brand, this is an opportunity for them to take this new content that they're starting to create, whether it's branded editorial or video or even social content like Instagram and Vine, which I think you're seeing a lot of brands embrace, and to put that into the overall feed. So to get back to your question about how do we make this a better environment, Sharethrough has really invested a lot of tech in making sure that we're only surfacing quality content to users. And one of those things is called the content quality score. So we're looking at how users are reacting externally to a piece of content. So if there's positive sentiment when they're sharing, those pieces of content will actually end up in your feed sooner than later.
All right. So that's what I think both of the previous speakers have touched on, and what I want to continue with Eddie now is sort of the aspect of measurement, accountability. If you are now taking dollars and actually putting something against a sponsored piece of content or putting something against paid amplification and distribution, usually, in my experience in advertising, the clients want to know, well, what am I getting for that? What are my metrics of success? How are you proving to me that there is some ROI? And I think this is the challenge that Eddie and Simple Reach have taken up. So I want to have him comment on, again, why now? Why is Simple Reach started in 2010 and not before? and how is it that you're bringing that accountability to a very difficult space to measure?
Sure. So one thing when we talk about content is that I think if your answer to any question in this space is it's because of content, is that doesn't really answer anything, because everybody here knows that content is nothing new. And so for us to be having this conversation, it's not about content, it's what else has changed. And unless you can answer that, then you really don't understand the driving forces behind this. So, even when you talk about distribution of content, whether it's guys like Sharethrough and Outbrain and so forth, right? Like, why now? Well, one of the key things is that it's the first time in the digital web that you have sources that are dedicated to content so that it's affordable to actually go invest dollars to drive people to where your content lives, right? That's something that's never been seen before. Because if you think about even 10 years ago, right, you could have gone and taken your content and served it through display. But the problem is that that slot that you're going after it has 100 competitors. And all those competitors have a lot more money to throw it at you than you can. And so, for example, let's say that there's a slot, and I'm Netflix, and my cost around, or what I can afford to get out of that click is $100 conversion. Because if you sign up for Netflix, that's what I can afford. That means I can go and throw $20, $30, $40, $50 off that click, and if you convert, I still make money. How can someone in the content space compete in that environment? So the thing about Outbrain is that you can't do anything but content. So you take that competitive dynamic out of the equation, and that allows for the first time people to go and have an environment where they can go do that. And that's like a really fundamental thing that didn't exist before. And so it's not coincidental that the rise of paid distribution around content also coincided with the rise of many sources that were for the first time dedicated strictly around content itself, right? The other thing is that, when we talk about, as much as we talk about social, and I'll tie this into, the measurement side, but as much as we talk about social, it doesn't get nearly enough credit. And, one of the things about social is that it created a unique opportunity for the first time in history, which is that for the first time, you could reach your customer without anyone interfering and without anybody going and collecting rent. Right? So think about that. In any other medium throughout history, whether it was television, radio, print, even a billboard or handing out a piece of paper, you could go get your messaging out, but someone was going to charge you in some way, shape, or form for it. Whereas today, Starbucks can go and push out a message to millions of people, right? And not a single person collects anything. Twitter doesn't charge you for that. But the difference was that for the first time, you now had to go and earn and retain your own audience, right? And what that meant was that you had to go and create the equivalent amount of value that I'm going to get if I choose to follow a friend of mine on Twitter, another company, a publication. You had to compete at that level. And it turned out that the way to do that was that you had to sound like those other people. And part of that meant that you had to create value, whether it was through content that entertained, that educated, or inspired, or whatever else it might be. Right? And so that dynamic, in order to go and take advantage of the fact that you had this incredible free distribution channel, meant that you had to create content. Right? And so it's not that content has changed, it's that this opportunity came about, which made sense that if you want to succeed in that channel, you had to go create content to get there. Now, when you're talking about the measurement side, I mean, it's really, we don't think of measuring content as being any different from measuring anything else. At the end of the day, your business is going to have a goal or a KPI. There is going to be some sort of objective around which you are going and doing all this marketing. And so whatever that KPI is, tell us what that is, or tell whoever you're working with what that is, and figure out the things that are indicators on how to get there. And whatever that is, it doesn't matter how you do it. It's just the metrics that matter the most are not content metrics. You are not creating content to become a content creator. You're not creating content to become a media publisher or a media company. You're creating content because it is a marketing channel. And so if you start measuring content like a content creator, then you're doing it wrong, because that's not why you should be doing it in the first place.
So, I think you've set the table extraordinarily well to dig in on this question of influencers, of people to whom you send your message, whether it be with paid amplification or through straight, the social networks that you've built up as a brand. And then you find people that may be more valuable to you than others. people who have built their own level of influence, their own massive networks of ready and willing audiences to hear what they have to say. And in my experience, part of Simple Reach's offering is to identify who those people might be. How would you then take advantage of that additional reach, that additional impact that you might get by engaging those folks in those social channels?
Sure. I mean, so, one of the things that's incredible is that you shouldn't think of influencers or individuals as any different from a publication or a media company. Because at the end of the day, they are in and of themselves a media property, right? It's just a one-man media property or one individual that has a distribution or an audience the same way a media company would, and they're creating content. They're just doing it in smaller bites in most cases, and sometimes it's more curation than original creation. But that's really all they are, right? It's just the idea of a media company put differently as a single entity or a single person. And what you're seeing right now in the market is that in the same way that people would take content networks or publications and bundle them up into an ad network, people are going out and trying to create scale and efficiency around individuals as well and bundle them into the equivalent of a network. And so there are a lot of great companies out there that are kind of leading on that charge. You should go, if you're a strategy where you're trying to go take advantage of those influencers, which you absolutely should, it doesn't make sense for you to go and reach out to each individual, whereas you can, but, really it's the networks that already exist, and there's an entire ecosystem already being created to help facilitate that.
Excellent. So I want to go back now to the question of the content that's actually being created. As a publisher, as a brand, we're going to talk about, really what in these professionals' experience they find the most engaging. And again, how is this different than what came before? So I think there was a great comment that Mr. Armano captured from an earlier session about content marketing not just being the new word for an advertorial. There is something substantively different between what we're doing now and what we did then. And I want to ask John kind of his opinion on what the difference is.
Yeah, so first off, I'm not going to attempt to define, what is or isn't content in the abstract. I think we could spend all day doing that. I can talk a little bit around how Outbrain chooses to define content. We, based on the way our platform operates, have a very high-level kind of guiding principle, which is if you're reading an article or watching a video and you get to the bottom and you see a recommendation, if you click on that and you feel like what you were sent to was an ad or you feel like you've been duped, that's a bad user experience, and that's something we're never going to do. Now, we have got pages of examples that support that, but I think ultimately that's the sniff test. If you feel like you're reading an ad, you probably are. And I know it's super subjective, and I'm not going to quote the Supreme Court in probably the most analogous example, but I think everyone understands where I'm going. I think it's one of those where you need to take a step back and kind of put into place some very basic common sense. I also really liked your point about, brands aren't publishers. Brands are selling products or services. I used to work at McDonald's corporate. I represented our sponsorship of the Olympics and the World Cup. While we were big supporters of those events, ultimately those events had a responsibility to deliver on business goals and objectives, right? And content, works by the same token. We've worked with endless clients who have wanted to test Outbrain. Well, I can tell you guys a secret. Our algorithms work. If we serve a recommendation to something interesting, someone's going to click on it. But ultimately, if you haven't predefined your criteria, it's not going to be a success, and there's nothing we can do ultimately to influence this. Does that help?
Okay. He shall not attempt to further define content today, but he knows it when he sees it.
Not
That's
in
what
the
he's talking
abstract.
about.
I get in trouble.
All right. Then, Nate, I want to ask you kind of, similar question. What do you feel is, and I want to put a specific wrinkle on it for you. What is the difference between what we have known as advertorials, as the attempt to blend brand messaging and editorial content that we've been doing for many, many years? That's the first question. The second question is, how have you and Sharethrough made a specific attempt to adapt the content consumption experience for mobile, which, if you look at most stats, especially across social networks, Twitter crested 50% in terms of mobile consumption several years ago. I think Facebook hit that milestone this year. Even YouTube, even video consumption is now happening almost on par on mobile as it is on desktop or other devices. And I know Sharethrough has always made that kind of a core principle of how they design their offering, how they create content consumption experiences for users. So if you could kind of touch on both of those areas, it'd be ideal.
Yeah, I think it makes sense to start with the mobile side of that. And, Facebook is not alone in that. I think every one of our publishers, and we work with most of the top publishers in the US, like Time Inc. is one of our big corporate deals, work across all their properties, work with Hearst as well, and Forbes and a number of others. But pretty much across the board, every publisher is telling us that their traffic has crested in the end of 2013, meaning that mobile is now the dominant source of traffic, whether that's apps or mobile sites or something like that. Everyone's thinking mobile first. And going back to my earlier point, that's why the feed arose, and that's why we're building all of our products really around that feed-based experience, which, as I said before, really only works with content, because you don't want to be seeing something there. If you're scrolling through headlines, you're catching up on your day's news, wherever you happen to be, you don't want to end up seeing something that is 0% APR financing or belly fat or something like that. So from an overall, how that's changed the kind of advertorial content landscape, I think it's just forced brands and publishers to be more honest about what's happening in those environments. It's such an intimate experience. Like, if you think about your phone, the idea of just handing it to someone else is going to feel inherently uncomfortable, because that is almost an extension of you, as creepy as it is to say that. That is your personal space. So I think brands and publishers are starting to become very conscious of that, and realizing that they have an entire new palette of content that they can use to engage in that conversation. In the past, it might have been, an advertorial in a print magazine, where now, if you look at the way brands are able to interact, they can do YouTube videos, they can work with publishers like Quartz to publish new content, they can write their own content and have hubs. If you look at, like, Pepsi.com has a great hub of just content that works for their brand. There's also Instagram, there's Vine, there's just this entire spectrum of content that brands can work with that speak to pretty different groups of audiences. And what has come down to a brand is now they have to look at this palette and just be much more honest about what they're doing. And I think it comes back to some sort of brand goal, where in the past, like, yes, you need to be driving some sort of business objective, but from a content perspective, that objective, I think, really just needs to be some sort of awareness. And I think Red Bull has done a tremendous job of, everyone right now will think of the Felix Baumgartner jump as like the pinnacle of Red Bull's recent content marketing efforts. And yeah, that had nothing to do with an energy drink. But at the same time, now Red Bull is on the tips of everyone's minds, and it associates with this idea of just Red Bull being able to support your extreme sports or whatever's going on in that environment. And that's why they're sponsoring the X Games, working with all these groups. So it's not necessarily saying, okay, in the past, my content needed to tell you every individual feature about my car or my product or anything like that. It's more just the content can now just align with an idea that makes sense for your brand, and that can still be considered success.
I think it's a critically important point to make, is that I think one of the big differences is, given it's a complex space to play in. It's very different taking the time to actually co-create or produce something on your own that you feel meets the standard of something that people want to consume,
Exactly.
Something that doesn't feel like an ad. And at the same time, there's this impetus, and anytime you're getting into something that's that level of investment, resources, and complexity, you really want to throw all your product attributes as a brand in the kitchen sink at getting a really high ROI out of that. And it's important to realize that you can take a step back and take a cue from companies like Pepsi, Red Bull, Starbucks, and say, I'm creating content that simply furthers your understanding of my brand essence. And I always also agree that pushing a guy out of a spaceship has set a new bar. And I think we should all aspire to thinking about that level of wow factor as we do this. So I want to now move into sort of an area of discussion. There has been a fair amount of say controversy in the news recently, in the news media as well as within our industry, about kind of the hurdles and the pitfalls and the danger that come with doing content marketing. And the first question I want to ask John, Outbrain, some others have made the news recently for making, I guess the question is under scrutiny for how overtly companies have disclosed brand sponsorship of content. Is this something that's part of the natural editorial feed, or is this something where a brand has had a hand in putting this content in front of you? Do you think that the discussion, the questions, the charges have merit? How have you responded to them? How do you think the industry should respond to them?
All right. Well, first off, I definitely need to call headquarters and ask why we didn't send our lawyer out here. No. But in all seriousness, I think this is really a healthy dialogue. So Outbrain essentially created this space. We took the real estate that was below an article or video that no one wanted and started using it to make recommendations. And now that gets clicked on 7% of the time, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. So 7% of the time someone's reading an article, they click on one of our recommendations. What we've seen is actually the disclosure has gotten more prominent over time since our inception about 5 years ago, but interestingly enough, for different reasons. So at first we had a little question mark, which a person could click on and see that Outbrain was the one providing these recommendations. Then all of a sudden we found ourselves in an environment where there were copycats. So folks who took our business model but started running things that looked like ads were like, oh no, this is bad. We need to say powered by Outbrain. So we need to start to brand this, kind of the good housekeeping seal of approval, if you will. And then what happened is, no surprise, once you have more people in your space, regulators get involved and they have opinions on it. I think the recent controversy you're referring to is the one that took place in the UK, or at least was covered in the UK last week. What I can confidently say is we didn't know that exact feedback was coming, but we were so far ahead of it that we've been able to apply changes very quickly. So the one challenge with our business is we give our technology to the publishers, and they're ultimately the ones responsible for kind of the technical implementation on sites. But we've already, as a result of that communication, said, okay, there were things we were thinking about doing. These advocacy groups have a point of view. We think their point of view has some merit to it. Again, there's a confluence of ideals. So let's take some of the things that we were noodling around and maybe just move them a little faster.
Okay. Eddie, it's central to your business. What are your thoughts on the
disclosure specifically?
On disclosure specifically on what the future is going to look like? Is disclosure going to hurt that 7% click-through rate? Is there really going to be a substantive difference in a consumer's willingness to engage with content if they know that a brand is behind it?
Sure. So, obviously it has an effect. So to the extent that the FTC decides that there needs to be disclosures and how overt they need to be, then of course it'll have some degree of an impact. But what has allowed, one thing is that the idea that content publishers, content creators, or marketers that are creating long-form content shouldn't invest to distribute their own content is really an analog way of thinking. And so, but I'll explain why, and why I specifically use the word analog. There is no other type of content creator that doesn't market their own product. If you are in film, if you are in music, or you're in television, right, you go and you market your product, right? Because that is your product. The content is your product. Now, if you look at any television station, one of the largest advertisers on any television station is that TV channel promoting their own shows. So if you are a content creator and content is your product and you've created a great product, why wouldn't you want to get that in front of as many people as possible? And you're limited inherently by your organic distribution. You're only going to have so much of an audience. So are you saying that there isn't a potential larger audience that could consume that and enjoy that you should get in front of? Right? If you look at someone like, let's look at Hollywood, right? The majority of their earnings comes from a handful of movies. And they make sure that they market the hell out of them because that's the only way they're going to get that distribution, right? And so one of the things is that because of the nature of the law of numbers around content, if you don't market your product, then you're in trouble. And here's like a basic number. You can look at this across the board. 10% of your content should drive 90% of your traffic. If you are doing it right, you're going to naturally see that number. If 50% of your content drives 50% of your traffic, it means that you've actually left a lot of potential on the table. It means that out of your top 10%, you didn't get what you were supposed to get. And the other side of it is that everyone talked about the long tail for a while, right? The value of the long tail, complete BS. In the sense that as a content creator, it's a game of winners. Content is all about the outliers. And so you need to make sure, so what happened is that technology and the internet democratized the creation content, but also did a lot of things on the distribution side. And it made it such that, especially with the rise of social, it's all about the few winners. Someone like BuzzFeed creates 300 pieces every single day, and there are only a handful of those that really take off. But they have to create the 300 in order to identify the top 5 or the top 10, because that's how the law of numbers work. And so if you don't identify the top 5 or top 10 and invest behind them, then you're leaving all your opportunity on the table. And here's why traditionally publishers think the way that they do. Because it's funny that a lot of our values are ascribed by our environment or our constraints. Now, one of the things is that in an analog world, every other type of content producer was able to market their product, right? Whether it was a song, a hit single, a TV show, or film, except for editors, except for news producers. And the reason is because in the analog world, right, all content was bundled into the newspaper. You couldn't market a story. Even if you wanted to, you couldn't do it in the way that every other content creator was able to. And when that translated over into the digital world, all of a sudden, stories became unbundled from the paper itself so that you had that ability. That's something that's completely new. But the values that a lot of the publishers and the content creators hold on to are from, and that's why you specifically use the word, the analog world. But because the nature of digital has changed all that, you have to go and play by the new rules. And if you don't, you can't succeed. And distribution and paid distribution is fundamental to that.
You have teed me up perfectly, Eddie. Thank you. Nate, on the topic of the individual story, clickbait. Everybody heard of clickbait? Everybody kind of get a sense of what to them that means? So, Nate, clickbait. Is it a fair critique of journalistic integrity or sour grapes from publishers who haven't adapted to digital consumption habits?
You know, I think it, and to be fair, I'm not a fan of clickbait. I don't think anybody is. But I think it goes back to what John was saying about his kind of sniff test for content. Like if you see something and you click through and you're unhappy with the experience, that's terrible. But I think the reason Upworthy has been able to build such an incredible audience is because for the majority of their content, they've been able to give you this sensational headline that gets you so excited about what happens. And then when you click through, you're actually pretty satisfied with what you've just seen. It's the idea of, overpromise and overdeliver. And I think you're going to see fatigue with the headline style. I think that's why BuzzFeed is starting to move away from the idea of listicles, and now they're doing quizzes. And there's all these different styles of headline and story that you can work with. And I think you'll always see a rise and fall as, someone figures out a new technique, people get excited about it, all the other imitators jump on, do something different. Like, there's always going to be that sense of it. But I think as long as at the end of the day you're delivering on whatever your headline was, you're okay and you're in a good space.
All right. So I want to now do a very quick sort of lightning round with the panel on one very specific question, and then we'll move into Q&A, hopefully jotting down some notes to have some good back and forth. So start with John. Church and state. What's the status?
As an American, separate?
As specific to our world, journalists, editorial versus brand content, church and state existed for a very long time. We see the lines blurring. What's your take?
I don't know if I buy off that those lines have always been clear historically. I think that as new technologies come forward, you're going to have to figure out how those or basically how that principle applies to that space.
Okay. Nate?
It's funny because it comes up in every publisher meeting. There's always a discussion about whether or not editorial is going to buy off on whatever we're doing. And I think it really comes down to the quality of the content you're making. Like, I think The Atlantic got in some hot water when they did Scientology, and that was a terrible example of church and state. But I think there's also publishers like Quartz who are doing a very good job of just Porsche sponsoring a really strong set of content about engineering. It's not about Porsche specifically. It's just, here is this interesting take on something that matters to us. I think as long as you're maintaining that sort of line, you're going to be okay in the church and state.
Okay. Eddie?
Yeah, so, we work with nearly every major sponsored content program for the leading publishers. So, we're adamant that church and state needs to exist, and it's largely to protect the publishers because at the end of the day, what they are selling now is their brand equity, and anything they do to compromise that is a losing business model.
Excellent. So I've been asked to make sure we leave a little bit of time at the end, about 10 minutes or so, for Q&A. So the floor is yours, and I'll try to moderate the Q&A as well as, or hopefully as well as I've moderated the discussion. Back here? Yep. Mhm. So no, I mean, from my perspective, again, it's the. No, I wasn't here for the story.
Armano, you want to tell it? No, there's not a long story. It's just Edelman created some really fantastic content for Kellogg's to support the Olympics. It was designed as social content, and it was so good that the client said, let's scrap a 30-second spot that we had purchased and instead slot this onto TV as a spot. So sometimes it's sort of the unintended happy consequence of doing good work.
The reason, the reason I'm here in the role I'm trying to play here, the philosophy to try to further here is that the where and the how we get our messages out there will borrow significantly from what advertising, sort of techniques and tools, technology built for advertising has forwarded. But the what is going to be different. And the what is going to be storytelling, it's going to be content-based, and now that these various technologies exist to help us distribute and then measure the impact of what we're doing, the idea is to demonstrate to the clients, demonstrate to advertisers and publishers how much more impactful that is than trying to use it on advertising. Right here. That's a toss-up. Who wants to jump in?
I guess I'll jump in. I think, so my background is George Washington, which is a very strategy-focused advertising approach. And I think what would have been really useful would have been knowing about certain buying models and just knowing how easy it is to really jump in and get your hands dirty. I think the old model of just advertising, especially distribution, since that's what we're up here talking about, would have been TV, radio, print. They're pretty expensive propositions to get in and not something that a student can really get their hands dirty on. I think as you start to look at biddable models like Twitter, like Outbrain, like Sharethrough, it's pretty easy to plug in a couple $100, play around with it, and learn something about content distribution. I think students now should really be aware of how easy it is for them to just quickly gain some experience in the technologies that are on the web.
It's a great question, and it's one where my answer to myself changes every year depending on what I'm doing. And my answer is going to be somewhat hypocritical given I've spent much of my career avoiding going to business school. So I actually think having a really well-rounded education is probably the best thing given how difficult it is to predict what's happening. So there have been periods of time where I thought, oh, it'd be great if I knew how to program. There have been other times where I've thought, I really should have gone really deep down into the well in finance. The one area that I keep coming back to is actually economics, though, because I think what makes economics so great, what made it so unattractive as a degree at the time is almost what makes it attractive to me now, and that's understanding financial markets, understanding systems, understanding how to run a regression analysis and get a causality. I'm being serious, like the one thing I did do. And so I think economics may be the best area just in terms of understanding kind of the importance of the marketplace and the needs and where to focus.
I agree largely with that. I think there's obviously the pragmatic side, just skill sets. But I think the other thing would be, I think trying to teach technology at any given moment is a losing battle because of how quickly it gets outdated. And so what I would say is that you have to learn more than anything to draw the line and to ask questions, right? So just a quick example, right? Why are songs 3 minutes long? Why, right? And you would think that there's a variety of reasons and whatever else, but the actual reason is because the original records could only hold 3 minutes, right? And then what happened is that as the radio came about, all the radio producers went and said, well, we could make songs longer now, but if we keep them short, we can add more songs in between commercial breaks and the listener feels like they got more. And that's actually the legacy around it, right? And the thing that we found, or just that I've personally found, is that if you can see where things ended up, right? How we got to this point, you can draw the line for where we're headed. So for instance, let's say you wanted to go and predict what Facebook is going to do next in terms of how they're going to change their algorithm and their feeds, and everyone talks about all this stuff, right? So actually, if you understand why Google and what Google had to do to make all the changes within their search results, is exactly the same problem. And it's actually why Twitter is going to fail if they don't make certain changes. Because here's the thing, right? Like, if you are successful, you create more content. You have more content. Everyone tries to use you as a channel. The problem then is that you have too much content and you have to go and curate that. How do you do that? You create a smarter feed. You create cleaner results. You go and get people who are trying to game your system and add in spammy results, whether it's search or whatever it might be, and you push them out. So there's certain things that are fundamental, right? Like if you become a channel and you're successful, there are certain byproducts around that are going to happen no matter what. And once you understand that, you can go translate that into any other channel in the future. The reason Twitter is going to fail, right as it stands right now, is because the nature of their product is actually inhibits growth, right? And what I mean by that is if you have enough content and you're following too many people, your feed becomes noisy. So you're actually going and decentivizing people from following more people, which means that your product's not going to grow. What does Facebook do to change that? They say, you know what, we can't just make this time-based. There's too many things we can put in front of a person at any given moment. There's 10,000 things every time you open up your feed, right? So at that moment, they said, let's make this smarter, right? Twitter actually, by not becoming a smarter feed, inhibits their inherent ability to grow because it creates a worse experience if you go choose to follow more people. So again, it's really about understanding and being able to draw those lines.
I would have said spend more time in the applied sciences because it's one of the few areas in college that actually rewards you for taking a swing at something and may not, you might not be right every time. But you learn from those mistakes and you draw upon larger and larger pools of data to eventually come up at something that has a chance to see the light of day. And that's something that I think the time I've spent in media, a lot of that time has been spent around ad technology and new formats and new ways of doing things. And without these sort of courageous advertisers who took those initial swings and said, I'm going to try this out, it wouldn't be something that we ever would have scaled up and become a standard and really a significant contribution to the way we do things. So a couple more minutes. One more question? Anybody? Son? Please. Please.
So I think this will help the professor sort of connect the dots and how to talk about this with your students because it certainly helps me understand the opportunities you can take to Amplify earns. So when you think about your PR students and you think about sometimes for us in PR, the holy grail is to get that fantastic story in the New York Times. And I'm thinking of one particular example, our Samsung client was here yesterday. And so last fall, our team worked really hard, and the client team and the editor team for months and months and months to get this unbelievable signature story in the New York Times. Knowing all that went into that, and then when it lands, it was sort of everything you hoped and dreamed, why wouldn't you then, if you had the opportunity, which we now do, through Outbrain and others, to spend a little bit of money, and I think you did this with a Samsung piece in the New York Times, earned piece, and I think Outbrain let me sort of $500. I mean, it was a very small amount of money. Why wouldn't you spend a little bit of money to try to get wider reach behind that story and get more people to see it and put all of it into it? So I think, when you sort of deconstruct it down to something like that, that's what we're talking about when we say using trade to amplify earnings, right? So this is, we talk about a lot of complex things here, but it really comes back to what we sort of originally set out to do in PR, right? Have that fantastic piece of editorial content, and then have it work as hard as it possibly can. So I think all of this just gives us a lot of new exciting ways to do that.
Exactly. I mean, this is...
Chris has taught me that.
No, that's exactly the point. Is that if we had opportunities to do, to Eddie's point, the points that my panelists have making, if we had opportunities to do things like this before, we would have. This is not something that if you say, look, I've worked very hard to create an asset or get a hit, I want as many people to see that as possible, or the right people to see it. And that's where we're saying, look, we can now take tools that we've been applying to banner ads or TV spots or things like that, and do the same thing, but actually put something in front of a person that they consider to be a useful story, something that's entertaining or informative, more so than just getting ads pushed at them. So that's the core of it. Happy to. So very, very quickly, to Nancy's point, what we're doing on the paid, the distribution of owned and earned, this is not 8-figure media budgets that we're talking about. This is not a mass. This is something where we can react very quickly. We can have a piece of content that we earn into a paid channel within minutes. and we can put a budget behind it that's in the hundreds or thousands of dollars and see a 10x increase in the number of people who are actually exposed to it. And it's not just, I mean, one of the points I'd love to drive home here is that it's not just about raw reach, it's about the right reach. It's about using data-driven targeting and modeling to put the message in front of the right people in the right context. So the old means of measuring the effectiveness of our earned strategies, we got hundreds of millions of earned impressions, that sort of thing, has given way somewhat to saying we got the right 100,000 views that led to a significant increase in those people sharing this with their trusted networks, and hopefully it's this happy symbiotic thing. Thank you to Eddie, Nate, and John for joining me. Thank you all for being a great audience. We'll talk soon.